of breath when he hit the ground and began breathing heavily, his eyes wide open. He waited for a few seconds before getting back up on his feet. He reached down and grasped the cold door handle with his bandaged hand and creaked it open. He looked down into the dark hallway and tiptoed out of his room. The window at the end of the hallway lit up the darkness with blue moonlight as he patted his way down. He could hear footsteps rustling around him, and faint giggling by the pitter-patter of small feet, which sounded like a child had run in front of him, giggling and running around. The hallway was a lot longer than he had remembered. It seemed endless, like the ride home from the hospital. He heard a door creak in front of him. "Mom," he called out in a shaky voice. Suddenly, a door slammed behind him and he jumped and turned around. Behind him he heard a long, eerie groan that sounded to croak right in his ear. He turned around as fast as he could and was suddenly face to face with none other but his dead sister. Her eyes were clouded white, her skin pale, and the right side of her jaw only dangled on by the tissue and muscle. Glass protruding from her forehead, and black blood leaked down her face. Her blonde hair pulled up back in a ponytail as it was, wearing her gray t-shirt and athlete shorts, which were dirty and spotted with blood. Her legs were bent in ways that couldn't be. She stood, emitted a long creaky noise, only an inch away from Toby's face. Toby yelped and fell back. "Ah!" He started to crawl backwards away from her, not able to break the eye contact he held with her. Blank, dead eyes. He dragged himself backwards until he backed up into something. He stopped for a second. Everything was dead silent except for the heavy breathing and crying. He slowly looked up to meet the blank face of a tall, dark figure that stood over him. Behind the tall, dark mask were rows of children, looking to range from 3 to 10 years old. Their eyes completely black and dark black blood leaked from their eye sockets. He screamed and stood up as fast as he could, only to be tripped by a dark black tendrils that wrapped around his ankle. He fell straight on his stomach and got the wind knocked out of his chest. He tried to scream out, but he couldn't make a sound. He wheezed out before it all went black. Toby woke up with a start. He screamed out and sat up as fast as he could, completely short of breath. He wheezed down and held his chest with his bandaged hand. It was just a dream. Just a dream. He laid back down on his bed and rolled over on his side. It felt like a giant weight had lifted off his chest as he took in deep breaths. He stood up and pattered over to his window. He saw nothing. Nobody was out there. No ghosts, no figures, nothing. He heard the rustling and coughing of his father at the doorway. His door was closed. He walked over and opened it, looking out at the hallway once again. He padded down the hallway and into the kitchen where he found his dad standing having a smoke in the living room. Toby waited a second and watched him from around the corner before a burning feeling started deep in his chest. Deep, boiling anger took over him. He heard the imaginary voices in his head.
Do it. Do it. Do it.
They chanted. He turned away and held his arms. He felt like he actually had control over himself, unlike he did for the past few weeks since he got home from the hospital. He actually had complete thoughts for just moments before they were clouded by the chanting of the little voices in his head.
Kill him. He wasn't there. He wasn't there. Kill him. Kill him.
They continued on. Toby trembled. No, he wasn't gonna do it. Wait, was he going crazy? No, he won't kill anyone. He can't. He hit his father, but hated no way that he was gonna kill him. That was it. The last thought he had before he fell into an ideal state once again. The influence of voices in his head was too much. He began to suddenly walk up behind his father. He reached over the counter to the knife holder in the kitchen and pulled out the largest knife that he had resting in the case. He gripped it in his hand. He felt a sensation take over his chest. He let out a snicker. He began laughing so hard he had to gasp to breathe. His father turned around abruptly before he felt a brute force shove him to the floor. He grunted as the air was knocked out of him. What? He looked up at the boy who stood over him, grasping the kitchen knife in his hand. Toby, what are you doing? He went to sit up and put his hands out in front of him for self-defense, but before he knew it, Toby was on top of him. He went to grab at his neck, but his father reached out and blocked his hand by grabbing onto the wrist. Stop! Get off of me, you little fucker! Yet with his other hand, he threw off center punch towards Toby's shoulder, but he didn't stop. The look in Toby's eyes was not sane. It looked as if a demon had taken over him. He yelled back and went to stab the knife into his father's chest, but he blocked him and grabbed onto his wrist once again. He went to shove him back, but Toby kicked out his feet in front of him and landed a hard blow straight in the face. His father recoiled and pulled his arms away to cuff his face, but Toby got back and drove the knife straight into his shoulder. His father let out a cry and went to pull the knife out, but before he could, Toby threw his fist straight into his face. He began to pound his fist into his head, laughing and wheezing. He cracked his neck and grabbed the knife and ripped it out of his shoulder. He drove it deep into his dad's chest and repeatedly stabbed him in the torso, blood spilling out and getting splattered everywhere. He didn't stop until his father's body was still. He threw the knife over to the side and leaned over his body, coughing and panting. He stared at his smashed-in face and sat there twitching, until a loud scream broke the silence. He looked over to see his mother stand a few feet away, covered her mouth, tears streaming down her eyes. "Toby!" she screamed. "Why did you do that?" she cried. "Why?" she screamed. Toby stood and began to back away from his father's bloody corpse. He began to back out of the kitchen. He looked down at the blood-soaked bandages on his hands and looked up at his mother one last time before he turned and ran out of the house. He ran to the garage and slammed his hand against the control panel on the wall and pushed the button to open the garage door. Before he ran out, his father's 2 hatchets that had been hanging on the tool rack above a table of full jars filled to the brim with old rusty nails and screws. One hatchet was new. It had a bright orange handle and a shiny blade. The other was old with a wooden handle and an old dull blade. He grabbed both and looked down at the table, and his eyes met a box of matches, and under the table was a red gasoline tank. He held both of the hatchet in one hand and grabbed the matches and gasoline before running out the garage, down the driveway and up the street. As he approached the street light that he could see out his bedroom window, he heard police sirens in the distance. He turned around and the red and blue flashing lights came rushing down the street. Toby stood for a second before he opened the cap of the gasoline tank and ran down the street, spilling gasoline all over the street after him, and turned to run to the trees. He poured the last bit of gasoline out before he reached in the pocket and pulled out a match. He struck it against the box and immediately dropped it. In an instant, flames burst out around him. The fire caught him to the trees and bushes around him, and before he knew it, he was surrounded by fire. The silhouettes of police cars were visible away into the forest around him. He looked around, but his vision was blurred. His heart was pounding and he closed his eyes for a moment. That was it. This was the end. Toby felt a hand on his shoulder. He opened his eyes and looked over to see a large white hand with long, bony fingers that rested on his shoulder. He followed the arm that was attached to the hand up to the towering dark figure. It appeared to be wearing a dark black suit, and its face was completely blank. It towered over Toby's small frame and looked down on him. Tendrils reached out from its back. Before Toby knew it, his vision blurred and he was surrounded by the sound of ringing in his ears. Everything went blank. That was it. That was the end. That was how Toby Rogers died. A few weeks later, Connie sat in her sister's kitchen. Her sister, Lori, sat next to her, drinking a cup of coffee. About 3 weeks ago, Connie lost her husband and her son, and a few weeks before, she lost her daughter to a car crash. Since then, she moved in with her sister. The police were keeping busy. They had just finished cleaning up the case, and the story had been released 2 weeks ago, and the focus of the world seemed to have shifted to complete new stories. Lori switched on the TV to a news broadcast. On the TV, the news report began introducing the new headline. We have breaking news. Last night there has been a reported murder of 4 individuals. There are no suspects yet, but the victims were a group of middle school kids who had been out in the woods late last night. The kids had been bludgeoned once and stabbed to death. The investigators had discovered a weapon at the crime scene, which appears to be an old, dull-bladed hatchet, as you can see here. The picture changed to show snapshots of the weapon exactly as it was left on the crime scene. Investigators had pulled the name of a possible suspect, Toby Rogers, a 17-year-old boy who, a few weeks ago, had stabbed his father to death and tried to cover up his escape by setting a fire in the streets and the forest around the neighborhood. Although they had believed the young boy had died in the fire, investigators suspect that Rogers may still be alive due to the fact that his body was never found.